interactions. So what's swarming? Well, swarming is the way that an entire colony of bees reproduces. So we have individual bees that eggs are being laid by the queen, larvae are being born, hatched. They feed those larvae, they seal them over, they pupate. Some days later, they emerge as a new baby bee. So about every 21 days, there's a cycle of worker bees being produced. And of course, those worker bees are dying off at various rates depending on what's going on. Well, all of those worker bees, plus the queen, plus whatever drones that are produced, are the colony. And so the way colonies reproduce is like the way that companies that are very successful on the Dow Jones stock average, how they do stock splits. So bees have a 2-for-1 stock split if they produce one swarm, or a 3-for-1 stock split if they produce 2 swarms, or a 4-for-1 stock split if they produce 3 swarms. So the process, we'll go through it briefly here before we talk about this year, but the colony is expanding in numbers of bees. It starts to get crowded. Crowding is critical for swarming. And then at a certain point in time, it does all the preparations. Then a group of those workers leave with the old queen. New developing queens are left in queen cells. They start to hatch out. The colony has to decide at that point. How they decide, we don't know. The colony has to, but it'll be that licks the queen, farm again, or stop the whole process. And in our bees in French Guiana in South America, we had some colonies that would send off a prime swarm plus 4 after swarms, I think it was. I think we got 5 swarms out of a single colony at times. Our European bees, on average, actually do 1 prime swarm with the mated queen and at least 1 after swarm with an unmated queen. And of course, the swarm size is the first swarm that leaves is usually the biggest. And then after that, the other swarms, secondary swarms, tend to be smaller. So this all starts back in the winter because the health of the colony going into winter, how healthy they are with respect to how many mites are there that might be killing bees over the winter. Viruses that the mites transmit might be killing bees over the winter. Probably suppresses 5 or 6 different. That gut parasite, that tends to, once they start cleaning up cells in the spring for the queen to lay eggs in, they get infected and they tend to die prematurely. So if a colony is pretty sick and they come out of this year very, very weak, they probably will never build up to the point where they reproduce and swarm. On the other hand, if a colony is very healthy and they come through the winter with lots of bees still alive and lots of food, then they're going to take off once the flowers begin to bloom and they start to get fresh pollen. They're just going to explode their population and they will be on the path to swarming. So this is my own invention again. This is my best estimate of how a colony of bees here expands and contracts in terms of numbers of bees over the course of the season. So we go into the winter with maybe about, when they stop rearing brood altogether, there's maybe about 20,000 bees. And gradually, as the winter goes on, those bees are dying off. And eventually get down to where there may be only as many as 7,000 or 8,000 bees. Now, by this point, all right, I've got some explanation in the next slide, but then it increases to the point where there's a swarm. A lot of the bees leave, then you get a new queen, they rear some brood again, and then they go into winter the next year. So some of these points are pointed out here on this slide. So that's the point where the swarm leaves, and you get an instantaneous drop of, say, I put it at about 50%, 50, 60%. The queen actually starts laying eggs, usually at least by the 1st of March. It differs depending on the year and where you are, but here I think it's usually around the 1st of March. And she's laying eggs from March through to about September 10th. And so that's the only period of year that the queen is laying eggs. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just over 6 months. And the rest of the year, the bees have to survive without any egg laying just by living really long periods of time. So let's go to the next slide. So you might look at this and go, well, so what's happening here is you got brood rearing. New bees are starting to hatch out right about here. But the colony, it's just a few, and the colony still has bees dying. So it actually continues to go down a little bit here before it turns the corner. And if you had a lot of nosema and this went all the way down here, before they can actually start to get enough emerging bees, it would die off. So there are various, this curve is going to be very dependent on how healthy the bees are and how early they get going with brood rearing, and if they have enough pollen to raise the young bees here. So then it explodes pretty quickly. They swarm, instant drop. Now look at this weird little thing here. As soon as the swarm is left, the colony increases in population. So the queen is left, but they leave at the point they swarm. They tend to swarm right at a peak in sealed brood production. So you've got all this brood that over the next, if it's sealed brood, over the next 13 days is going to be hatching out. And actually, in many cases, this actually goes up way higher than this probably. They get crowded again, and boom, they send a secondary swarm out once a virgin queen has hatched. But I didn't want to go into all that here. I just left it as a single swarm. So then there's a period that increase once there's brood hatching, but then it actually declines a little bit. Well, that's because the new queen comes out, mates, has to lay eggs, and it's quite a period of time before there's new young bees hatching out again. So they're actually losing bees and declining in population before it can turn the corner. So how does the colony prepare for swarming? What stimulates swarming? So this is what's critical here. We'll come to that in a second, but what we as beekeepers often want to do if we're interested in honey is we don't want the bees to do this drop in numbers of bees. We don't want them to swarm. We want to suppress the swarming so they continue to increase in numbers of bees, even higher than they would have gotten naturally. And then when the honey flow starts here, we've got this massive number of bees that can go out and bring in our 100-pound honey crop. So the colony population is high for a bit, and then at some point in here, it regulates itself down. And it doesn't matter whether it's a hive that got super populous or whether it went through a swarm, they're all going to end up in October going into just about the same number of bees into the winter. It's amazing how they regulate their populations. So this is our natural colony here in the little blue line, and this is our managed colony where we've suppressed swarming, no swarms, in the red line. And this is our honey flow down here where mostly like June, July, maybe into August, and then we have a little goldenrod flow sometimes in September, depending on the weather. This goldenrod flow, I might mention, they can sometimes get enough food coming in that it simulates almost what's happening here, and some colonies will actually swarm in September when they shouldn't be doing anything like that because they just are at mercy of the conditions. So what influences bee swarming? So number one, food abundance. Bees don't swarm if there's not a good level of food coming in, especially pollen. I'll just leave it at that. And that tends to be, as I just said, at a point in late spring, and then sometimes in September if the foraging conditions are really good. Secondly, queen age. Older queen colonies with older queens tend to swarm more frequently than colonies with younger queens. We'll come back to why that is. And then finally, crowding. A large number of bees confined, especially in the brood nest, where they're rearing the brood, is really critical to stimulating swarming. And I just put this bad weather here because if you've got colonies that are building in size and getting more and more populous, and all of a sudden you get a cold snap like we're having right now, and it forces all those bees in a nice, tense, tight little cluster, and yet they've managed to already get enough food that they're already rearing lots of brood, it can really exacerbate the issues of swarming, which may be happening this year. Depends on what happens in the next week or so, I think. So the bees start rearing brood on stored pollen. That's one of the reasons they store pollen up in the fall, is they start raising brood before any of these flowers come out in the spring. 1st of March, there's no flowers out then. Then you get the early spring flowers, the crocuses, the willows, things like that. They're followed by the sugar maples in late April, early May, depending on the year. Then we get into another couple weeks from now, well, hopefully. The fruit trees are going to start blooming. Dandelions are out here. They're probably out your area starting. And so they get the steady collection of pollen that provides the resources they need to be able to rear lots of young larvae. So I just threw a little glitch in here. If you're out looking at your bees, you need to always be looking for American foul brood. And so here is a frame, a picture of some brood, sealed brood, with nice uniform light brown cappings, nicely domed up, very, very uniform. The other picture here, more scattered brood cells. The cappings are dark, they're kind of sunken down, they look greasy in appearance. The bees have started to chew little holes at them to try to remove some of this infected material, like you can see in that cell. And there should be a horrible odor coming off of this comb if it has this much infection in it as well. And you see anything like this, you need to deal with it by not just trying to mask it with drugs, but you have to burn up the brood frames at the very minimum, and probably burn up all the frames in the colony to prevent this infection from one hive spreading to other hives in your apiary or your region. So that's my little message about American flower brood. So let's come back to swarming. And so we've got this colony that's growing. And what's going to trigger all this swarming is what's happening right here with the queen and the workers that are her retinue of workers surrounding her. So that queen is producing a host of chemicals, pheromones. The best studied one we call QMP, queen mandibular pheromone. It comes from glands in the mandibles near the mouth. There are other glands, and there's a turgor gland in the abdomen that also produces pheromones that we don't know as much about. So these workers, where was I here? Oh, so the queen is producing this blend of chemicals, and the workers are actually this retinue of workers. They're just looking at her thinking she looks nice. They're doing a very important function. So that queen pheromone is very important in suppressing queen rearing. It's also very active in suppressing the development of the ovaries of the workers. Workers are female, just like queens, but they have tiny little ovaries. But I think most of you, if you've kept bees any period of time, if a colony loses a queen and doesn't manage to replace it, you get these colonies with laying workers in them, and you get lots and lots of eggs and all the cells and drones being produced in worker cells and things like that. So the queen's pheromone is actively suppressing both queen rearing and ovarian development in the workers. But how does it do that? Well, it does it by these bees that visit the queen that have a very special function. They've been named messenger bees by Tom Seeley at Cornell when he studied this. They're just like regular workers, but they temporarily, their job is to attend the queen. A few of them lick the queen and pick up this chemical from her by licking. Takes for total touch her with their antennae. But in the process of doing that, they're able to pick up that chemical, and then after they've picked it up, they turn and they move out through the colony. And they have to move out through the colony and contact other workers who pick it up from them. So each worker that antennates the queen, there's a lot more of them than there are licking workers, but they only really manage to suppress probably one other worker through their actions. But a bee that licks the queen probably suppresses 5 or 6 different workers as she moves from bee to bee to bee. And so lots of these interactions have to be taking place because the queen pheromone is like a radioactive substance. It breaks down, and its half-life, the time it takes for total amount on a worker bee to be reduced to half the amount, is only about 25 minutes. So if a worker visits the queen, 25 minutes later, it's only got half as much queen pheromone that it picked up. 25 minutes after that, it's only got a quarter. 25 minutes after that, it's only got an 1/8. So the amount is only about 20, constantly being secreted by the queen and then breaking down. So the only way it suppresses the workers from their, I guess you could call it, they have a tendency to want to rear queens, but they're being suppressed, inhibited. So the only way that they continue to be inhibited is if lots of workers are managing this process. So they have to be able to distribute the queen pheromone through the colony. And when your colony starts to look like this, when it's really crowded with tons and tons of bees packed between the frames and all over the frames, well, it's a traffic jam. They can't get out, they can't get through it. So they visit the queen, and then they try to like wind their way through this mess, and they don't get very far. And so bees out on the periphery, out on the edges of the combs, tend not to get enough of the queen pheromone to suppress their their innate desire to rear queens. So add on top of this that queens that are 2 years old or older start to secrete less queen pheromone. So you not only have the traffic jam happening, but you have less of it to begin with. So that's why queen age is also important in influencing the swarming of a colony. So we got queen age, we got crowding, and as long as the colony is healthy and it starts to get crowded, this is what happens. They start to raise queens. So the first thing you as a beekeeper see is you see these queen cups being produced. So these queen cups, this is a frame that's been tipped up on its end. So you're looking right at the very bottom of the frame. These cells are pointing downwards toward the ground. And they're just little wax cups. They look nice and neat and clean. They've been produced that year. This is another one that's been produced this year. If they're old, they'll get brown and kind of rounded on the edges. But these are nice new queen cups. And what do they mean? Do they mean anything's happening? Well, actually, no. Bees start producing those automatically in spring, and they produce them all during the summer. It's like they have them ready should they ever need them. But if they never need them, they just sit there. They just work on them here and there and keep them in shape. But most of the time, they mean nothing until at some point they manage to get the queen to lay an egg in them. I don't know how they manage to force a queen to do that or whether she wants to do it on her own. But eventually she moves, she lays eggs in these queen cups. And that's when we start to have a problem, because that's when the colony at that point is, my former advisor used to call it, they were in swarming mode. It's like they're in foraging mode where they have no interest in swarming, or they're in swarming mode. And it's like almost everything you try to do to stop it isn't going to work. You can try to break it, but it's going to be really tough because they've already turned the corner and kind of reached that collective decision that reproducing is what they need to do. So that egg is laid, and then now we've got here this queen cup. It's just starting to be elongated a little bit, but you can see the larva, curled up C-shaped larva sitting down in there. You can see all the royal jelly that it's pooled in there. Unless the colony is really in poor shape, they provide more royal jelly to the queens than the queens actually eat. Usually when they emerge, you look in the queen cell and there's a bit of royal jelly left behind. So once you see this, you've got a larva like this, it's like 1 day old. They're going to seal, if it's 1 day old, they seal the cell when she's about when the larva is about 5 days old. So it's got about 4 days more to go till it's sealing. And they generally will produce their swarm either on the day that they seal the cell or within the next 2 days after that. So you see this, your colony is about 5 or 6 days away from swarm. So here you see the same queen, well, not the same queen cell, but a queen cell here. 25 minutes later, it's only got heated at the tip. This one is really elongated. It's probably, I can't tell if that one's sealed yet or not. It actually looks like it might be. But they get the shape and the look of a peanut, about the size of a peanut. And so once they've sealed that queen cell, now think about this biologically from the bee's point of view. Would you want to leave with your mated queen in a swarm of bees if you don't know for sure that a new queen is going to come out to follow? No, you wouldn't do that. That's too risky, because you may be leaving with your queen, but the queen that's going to be left behind shares a lot of genes in common with you. So it's like you're leaving behind your cousins that you want to survive, like the new queen is going to be your sister. So they wait until the first queen cell is sealed, or a couple of days after that. And at that point, barring any kind of really major disaster, a new queen will usually emerge from that cell. They could get black queen cell virus, or a pesticide could affect a bear could affect the hive, and they can't keep the cells warm or something. But most cases, once they've got that cell sealed, it's been all the food it needs. All it needs to do is be kept at about the right temperature, and you'll get a new queen. So this is a graph here showing you get a few colonies that actually, I don't know, I call it mistakes, I guess. They might swarm a day before the first queen cell is sealed. This is the time of queen cell sealing here. So this is 1 day before the queen cell is sealed. But most of them happen a day after the first queen cell is sealed, and they go on for a period of time. But most of them are on the day of the queen cell sealing or after. Then what happens? Well, that queen cell, if it's here, it gets sealed. And queens are sealed for about 8 days. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. She emerges, and now she hardens up her cuticle, and she gets ready. And then if they want to swarm again, some point around here, you start to get the first after swarms that take off with a virgin queen. So the bees exit, as you probably, I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. It's one of the more exciting things that you can see in bee land. That's all I can say. I just love swarms. They're so fun to play with. They're so fun to watch. But you get this mass of bees in the air. Then some of them land on a branch somewhere. Well, they'll land in different places, and they'll start scenting with the tip of their abdomen, sending that Nasonov scent off into the air. And then others are attracted to that. The queen is actually still flying in the air. She's attracted to it. She lands with a cluster. If there's several clusters, they generally coalesce then to the one with the queen. And then they start to look for a new place to live. And that's a whole different process that's, I have a picture here about that in a second. But the older mated queen has gone with the swarm, and they've left behind queen cells that will hatch out into virgin queens. There you see the swarm nicely neatly clustered. Scout bees go out from this, start to look for new nest cavities that they could occupy. They come back and they dance those waggle dances, just like they use a waggle dance to send their nestmates out to find food and tell their nestmates where the food is. They do the same kind of waggle dances to inform the nestmates of the locations of cavities they found. It's really interesting. Instead of foraging for food, they're foraging for nest sites. There's our parent colony, got really crowded, tons and tons of bees. It sends off the first after swarm. It's a fairly large swarm I've tried to picture here. And after maybe 8 or 9 days, 10 days later, they send off an after swarm. If they get crowded again and a new virgin queen has come out and they decide that collectively, however they do that, they should reproduce again, they send out another one. Generally, they get smaller and smaller as you go, but they're not uncommon. They're pretty regular, these after swarms. With virgin queens. They're usually gentle, so you don't have to fear them, but I had a funny thing one time. I had a friend and I said, hey, let's go catch the swarm of bees, and they're so gentle. So I go out with my Hawaiian shirt and my shorts on, and I guess when swarms start to run out of food, they become hot swarms, they're called. They become rather defensive. I tried to shake that swarm in a box, and next thing you know, we were all running in different directions. It was rather amusing. So usually it's a good idea to wear a veil and actually protect yourself because they aren't always so gentle. If you're Dr. Norm Gary out in California and you want to be really crazy, you create an artificial swarm with thousands and thousands and thousands of bees and a queen tied under your chin, and then you go play your clarinet for people and look like a fool. I just can't imagine doing this myself, but he's done this many, many times. I don't know, maybe one of you saw that, what was the kind of State Farm Insurance, I think it was, he used to advertise for, and they had him doing this on their ad. It's crazy. So when you go to hide the swarm of bees, at this point, if they've been out of the hive for a couple of days, they're generally, as I said, they're usually really, really gentle. You can hide them on foundation, frames with foundation, like you see in this picture on the left. You can hide them on frames that are fully drawn out, should you have them. But bees in a swarm will build comb very, very quickly. If you want to get some frames of foundation drawn out, hive a swarm of bees on them, because they will, in about a week, they'll draw about 6 or 7 combs out, and you'll be just amazed at how nice they are. So I generally make a hole in the center of the frames, maybe 3 or 4 frames on each side. I make a space, and then if I've got my swarm on a stick like this, I go over and I shake them right into the nest where I want them. And then you can set the frames back in. They tend to sit on top of the bees a bit, but they'll settle down into place. And then you've got the bees right where you want them. Another system, this beekeeper has set up a double hive body, and that's rather robust. But maybe it looks like it's a pretty darn big swarm there. But he's put an empty hive body on the top with no frame, so you can just shake the whole thing in there, then throw the lid on it. The bees will all drop down onto the combs and the frames, and then a day later you can take this empty hive box, and then you've got all the bees right where you want them. Now I know some beekeepers, they say, oh, what you should do is put a sheet on the ground and a ramp up to the hive, and then you dump all the swarm on top of the sheet, and then the bees run up the ramp into the hive. And I gotta say, it's one of the more exciting things to watch when you watch a swarm of bees, because once you get some bees that find the hive up here and they start to scent with their little gland at the tip of the abdomen, all these bees turn and they're all just running up the ramp and they're all scenting and they're all diving into the hive. But quite honestly, if you want these bees from their, is put them here. Don't put them here where something else could happen to the queen or something. Put them where you want them. But it can be fun to watch. It's a lot of fun. So then after they've swarmed and you get this first queen cell that's sealed, after about 8 days, like I said, the queen will be mature. She will chew her way cleanly around the edge of the queen cell and exit and leave usually this little cap hanging down at the edge of the cell. So you can almost always tell that the cell has had a queen emerge by this nice clean cut at the base. Sorry, not the base, at the tip of the cell, the mouth of the cell. I guess you could call it, they have at the point when the colony is done swarming and they decide no more, but there's still some sealed queen cells, then the workers and the queen get together and they collaborate and they chew down, they chew hole, I can't get my head, they chew a hole in the comb in the cell, and the queen eventually will work her way over here and dive in there and sting the queen, her rival queen that's in the cell. This, that's for the photo. There's a great video I found last year online that shows, it's black and white, but it shows the queen for about 30 minutes working around and showing these queen cells and showing her trying to get through to sting her rival in the cell. It's very clear that she stings and eventually successfully does sting the cell, and then the worker bees do the rest. So if you want to know how to prevent swarming, I should have had a blank slide here, but you already know everything about how to do this because I've already told you how to do it. One, you don't want to have older queens that are 3 years old or even 2 years old. You should probably be in the habit of replacing queens every 2 years. I know in recent years with issues with pesticides, a lot of queens don't even last a whole year anymore. It's frequent for beekeepers to replace their queens every year or even twice a year. It's very worrisome. I'm very concerned about that. But 2 years old is one. And then you need to eliminate crowding. So how do you do that? Well, if you've got your bees in a single hive body, then you put another box on top with frames in it, and preferably with combs in it so they can spread out and have twice the volume. If you don't want the queen laying eggs in that upper box, well, then you put a queen excluder between the lower box where the queen is, and then you put your new hive body with frames in it on top. If your new box has only frame, if you don't have any drawn combs with comb, you only have frames with wax foundation, then you have a little bit of a problem because even when you put it on top, the bees aren't all that motivated to move up onto empty comb. They like drawn comb. They like real, they don't like foundation. They like real cells. So even though you give them this extra box with all this volume, they may stay in the bottom box, stay crowded, and still swarm. So the way you get around it is you go into your bottom box and you go to some of the outer frames that maybe have honey in them or have just a little bit of brood. You make sure that the queen isn't on them. So if you're going to move her up above a queen excluder, and you move a few of those frames up into the top box to draw the bees up in, and you put a couple of frames of foundation into the lower box out at the edge. I don't recommend completely breaking up the brood nest of bees. I don't like doing that. I think they have their own, they develop their own order in the colony, and if you mess with that, you're really probably not helping them. That being said, my second item here is exactly that. When it gets farther along and it's warm, you could actually take the bottom box and move it and switch it and put it on top if you have 2 bees and 2 hive bodies. But if it's at all cold like it is right now, you've taken that brood nest and you broke it into 2 pieces separated, and you're not helping the bees out much in doing that. So I'm not real keen on doing that, but it will immediately break up the congestion and move the bees out if you do that. And I put on the thing down here, this thing is warning again, cool rainy weather in May. Keeping all those bees, if they have lots of young bees they're rearing and they're got lots of bees emerging, and yet they're confined into a tiny space where they have to pack in to stay warm and keep the brood warm, you have just created amazing crowding conditions that will stimulate queen cell production. And so you really need to be cautious then at trying to stop whatever may happen, the swarming. Now, if a colony has swarmed, sorry, I'm really talking a lot here, but if a colony has swarmed, before you go in and start ripping down queen cells, you need to make sure that you actually have a queen still in the colony. Let's say that you go in 3 days after the swarm has left, and all the queen cells are either still sealed or they haven't even finished rearing the young queen larvae in them. And you go in and you tear them all down. Well, you've just left your colony queenless. You've just literally destroyed your hive. So you need to make sure that at least one of those queen cells has that nice round, cleanly cut exit hole at the bottom of the cell to tell you that a queen has emerged. Now, a couple things you probably won't be able to do to stop swarming. One of them, people think, well, okay, they're producing these queen cells, and I don't want them to swarm. Well, yes, you probably do want to go through. If you don't want them to swarm, you probably do need to go through and try to tear down all the queen cells if you can. The problem is these bees are generally really good at hiding that they continue to be in places where you just don't find them. And so it's very, very frequently, it's very frequent that the beekeeper misses at least one of the queen cells, and all they need is one. And the bees will sense it, and they'll go ahead and they'll swarm. So it's a good idea to destroy the queen cells, but that on its own is unlikely to stop the swarming. You also, even if you do manage to destroy them all, you still haven't stopped the conditions, you haven't eliminated the conditions that lead to swarming, which is mostly crowding. So if they're still crowded, well, they're just going to turn around and start raising queen cells again. So that isn't going to work. And I already said if queen is left, but no virgin queens have emerged, you run the risk of leaving the colony queenless by killing those queen cells. So just destroying queen cells, yes, it's a good idea. If none of them are sealed yet, it's probably a good idea to do so, but you probably won't stop swarming that way. You really have to break up the congestion with one of those methods on the last slide. And some people think, well, I'll clip the wings of the queen, then she can't fly. I tried that when I was doing my work in South America. I thought, well, this is great. I've got the wings of the queen clipped. She won't fly. So what did they do? They got crowded. They reared virgin queens. The first virgin queen emerged, and the colony swarmed with a virgin queen and left my queen that had its wings clipped behind in the hive. So I didn't stop the swarming. I just delayed it maybe a week for one of those virgin queens to take off. And again, you haven't eliminated the conditions for swarming by clipping the queen's wings. The conditions for swarming are older queens, which you can only do by regular requeening, good foraging conditions, which you actually have no control over whatsoever, crowding due to weather, which you have no control over, and crowding due to not giving the bees enough space, which is the one way you can manipulate the bees and have some control. So that's it. You got to stop the crowding. And I wanted to leave this off with how at this time of year you can also trap swarms of bees. So here in Ontario, our bees are usually swarming somewhere between late May and into mid-June, maybe late June. It all depends on weather and foraging and stuff that's happening now. And when those bees come out and swarm, those older bees start looking for nesting cavities. They'll go out at least 5 kilometers out looking for nest cavities. That is an area of over 80 square kilometers they're checking out for new places to live. So when they're looking for those places, what do they look for? Well, the things that, this has been studied by Tom Seeley again, he's my guru for bees. This is a very old study he did on, what they did, it was very clever. They made trap hives. They made just boxes, empty boxes that they would set out in pairs. And within each pair, there'd be only one condition they were varying. So they'd put out a box that was 5 meters up on a tree, and right near it another box that was 1 meter up on a tree. They'd put out a box with an entrance facing south and an entrance facing north. Two boxes, sorry. They'd put out 2 boxes, and one would be, no, those in the case of swarming, they actually put out 3 or nest volume. they put out 3 boxes together. They put out a 20-liter hive, which is like a 5-frame nuke. They put out a 10-liter hive, which is like a 10-frame regular hive body. And they put out a 20-liter or 80-liter box. That was 20, 40, and 80, double the normal size of a hive body. And what they found was the bees preferred the 40-liter volume. So what do bees like? They like about the size, the volume of one hive body, one of our Langstroth hive bodies. They like something that smells like bees. I'm going to use beeswax, but some people use lemongrass oil in a kind of a dispenser. They like the entrance near the bottom of the cavity, not up at the top. That was the other pair of conditions they did. They like a cavity that's up higher off the ground than down at ground level, but that creates some problems for setting them out up there because you don't want to fall off a ladder while you're just trying to trap a swarm of bees. And if the bees need to find these things. So if they're really heavily shaded in the vegetation, it's going to be hard to find them. Whereas if they have a fairly clean line of sight for flying bees, they're more likely to find them. So this is what happens with one of these debates that bees have over swarms of cavities. So this is one of the swarms that Tom Seal in his study, I think it was Susan Berman, that they did of a swarm in Ithaca, New York. So there's the swarm in the middle. This is looking down on it from above like a map. So north is up and down is south, and to the right is east, and to the left is west. And this is different points in time. And each color indicates a different nest cavity that the bees found. And the width of the length of the bar indicates how far away the nest cavity is from the swarm. And the width of the bar indicates how many bees were dancing at that point in time for that swarm, or for that cavity. So you got a bee here that found a cavity here. This is the distance down here. There's a kilometer. So that's about a kilometer almost due north. So one bee was doing a dance, a waggle dance on the surface of the swarm that, knowing how to interpret the dance, they could tell was a cavity that was about due north. And so this is, they had about 12 or 14 bees that were going about 2 kilometers to the east. Some other bees were going 3.1 kilometers off over here, mostly to the west, to cavity number E, letter E. So at this point in time, shortly after the swarm started, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different cavities were being scouted. This swarm eventually scouted 11 cavities. You can see that G here comes in at this point, H comes in at this point. I is suddenly here a little bit later in the day at 3 to 5 p.m. By the next day in the afternoon, they found J and K off to the north, a little bit northeast and to the northwest. But the colony, in the end, this is the cavity that they eventually moved to, and they reached a consensus. And all the bees, the width of this shows that several hundred bees probably were all dancing for this cavity off to this west-southwest. They didn't find that cavity on the right at the start on the first morning. They found it pretty soon after that. And it still was pretty popular here with dancers late that afternoon. But B here had many more dancers for it than that one did. Not many more, but more. And even the next day, by the end of the day, B was still getting more dances for it than cavity G. And finally, though, through the process, they eventually ended up agreeing on this site, and then they all fly to that site. So that's what the bees do in the swarm. And so here's a nest box. These are a couple examples of trap hives that people have put up. Color doesn't matter. Both of them are fairly visible. This one's closer to the ground, obviously, than this one that has a ladder by it. They're set on a branch, and they've got some kind of straps around it. What I'm going to do this year is I'm going to put out, I've got 6 empty hive bodies that were bookshelves in my office that are going to turn into beehives now. And I'm going to get some frames, and I'm going to fit them with a strip of foundation. So if the bees do find it and colonize it, they'll build nice straight combs and a nice line from my frames inside the box. But I'm not going to put a telescoping lid on like you see here. That's just asking for disaster when I try to take it out of the tree and it falls off, or this one falls off, and I've now got bees flying everywhere in my face. So I'm going to actually cut 2 pieces of plywood, one for the top and one for the bottom, and I'm going to screw them right onto the hive body with screws. If I do nails, I'll probably have to shake everything up to get the nails, to get the boards out, but with screws, I can fairly gently undo the screws. I only probably need 1 in each corner to hold it on. Then I'm going to drill a little hole in the front, at least an inch in diameter, maybe an inch and a half in diameter, somewhere near the bottom of the hive, because that's preferable. I'm going to hang it on a tree with the entrance facing south, because they prefer south over north, or maybe on somebody's porch or something. I'm not going to put them all in one place, because if I put them all in one place, a swarm of bees is going to find them all at the same time. So I want to actually catch different swarms of bees. So I'll put them a few kilometers apart from each other. And then if any of them get occupied, well, then I pull them down. I can replace these little starter strips with actual full sheets of foundation with the frames wired and everything else. And I'm off to the races with my beehives that I haven't kept for myself for about 20 years. So here I go at age 68, getting into beekeeping again. What is wrong with my head? I don't know. I guess that's what beekeepers do, right? And I think that was it. So thanks so much for your attention, and hope I didn't talk too long, and I hope you got something out of this.